Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, Ecocide is State Crime, which is being organized by the Center for Climate Crime and Climate Justice and the International State Crime Initiative, both of which are research centers based here at the School of Law at Queen Mary. My name is Angela Sherwood, and I'll be chairing tonight's panel. With tonight's event, what we're aiming to do is to continue a series of conversations that we've had over the last couple of events on law and the politics of law and ecocide. However, tonight we're taking somewhat of a different track by focusing on the role of the state in the understanding of the production of environmental crimes. The state's roles often tend to fade to the background when the focus is explicitly on corporate activity and the criminalization of actions of private individuals for environmental damage. We have a very exciting panel with us here tonight to speak about these themes. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Richard Falk. Richard is a chair in global law at Queen Mary, and he is the founder, one of the founders and co-directors of Queen Mary's Center for Climate Crime and Climate Justice. Among Richard's many achievements and scholarly contributions, he is one of the first to use the term ecocide in response to policies of deliberate environmental destruction by the US government in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Richard's 1971 book, This Endangered Planet, was named by Foreign Affairs as one of the 6 most influential books for understanding the century ahead. And this book, of course, sits alongside Richard's long list of achievements and his work as a prominent activist and leading thinker in the field of international law. Following Richard, we'll have Mònica Pons-Hernández. Mònica is a PhD candidate at the University of Rovira and Virgili in Spain. Mònica's research focuses on the study of environmental crimes and harms and how they intersect with state corporate crimes. She recently published an article in Critical Criminology exploring the impact of the revolving doors between the state and corporations in Spain's fossil fuel industry and the consequences that this has for climate change. And last but not least, we'll hear from Stephen Donziger. Stephen is an environmental justice lawyer who spent more than 3 decades advocating for indigenous and rural communities in Ecuador's Amazon. Stephen helped these communities win an absolutely historic $9.5 billion pollution judgment against the oil giant Chevron, which was affirmed by 3 appellate courts, including the highest court of Ecuador. However, it's what happened after this judgment that has really catalyzed international attention to Stephen's role as an environmental defender and lawyer. Since the case, Chevron has launched a vicious campaign against Stephen, coming after him personally, professionally, and financially through litigation, and has been aided by members of the US judiciary to wage what can only be understood as a very chilling campaign of corporate and judicial harassment. So we're very grateful to all 3 of our speakers for joining us here today to speak on these themes of state corporate crime and the state's role in facilitating environmental harms and damage. Before I turn the floor to Richard, I just want to say a few things about housekeeping. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes today, which should bring us up into the hour or so. We'll then have around 30 to 45 minutes for questions and discussion. If you're in attendance of tonight's session, you can ask questions in the Q&A either by raising your hand or by adding questions to the chat. And please do feel free to pop your questions into the chat as we go along with the different speakers. There's no need to wait until the very end. We also ask that you ensure that your mic is off so that we can avoid any feedback noise. And just as a final note, we will be recording this event and uploading it to Queen Mary's YouTube channel. So if you have any objections, please just send us a message in the chat and we'll respond back to you. I think that is it from my side. I will now turn the floor over to Richard.
Thank you so much, Angela. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this panel, which I think is taking place at a time when thinking about how to make a criminal law approach to ecocide effective is extremely challenging. And I think there's been a great deal of activity, particularly in the UK, that has promoted an approach to ecocide by way of the International Criminal Court and adding to the Rome Statute, specifically Article 5, ecocide as a fifth crime. The present crimes are the three crimes pursued after World War II, crimes against humanity, crimes of war, and the crime of aggression. And then added to that is the fourth crime, genocide. I think it makes a lot of sense to add ecocide. At the same time, I don't think it will do much for a very long time to address the behavior that is ecocidal, whether it's corporate behavior or behavior directly attributable to the state. And it's partly a matter of the institutional engagement of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which seems interlinked with the UN Security Council in terms of controlling when investigations can go forward after a state has a state party to the ICC has requested a prosecutor to move forward. As we should know by the behavior of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, a veto, power of veto. So it seems to me rather unlikely and impractical to look toward the ICC UN linkage as a way of gaining much political traction over ecocide. At the same time, it may raise public awareness to some extent and mobilize states, particularly in the global south, to push for such an amendment. But I think we should think along other lines. And my own thinking was very much influenced, as Angela suggested in her introductory remarks, by my experience with deliberate ecological destruction as a tactic of the Vietnam War, a war tactic. And it's significant, not only anecdotally for me, but it's significant in the way the awareness that there was something new and criminal about what was being done in Vietnam. And it was being done by the US as a belligerent state, but it was being done with the collaboration of Monsanto and the makers of this deadly pesticide, Agent Orange. And what I think is significant in a glance backward is that the awareness of this came initially through a Scientific American article by Arthur Westing and Bert Pfeiffer, who I think, generated an interest on my part in understanding this from a law and criminal law point of view, and recognizing that we were dealing with a legal vacuum. And so the first step taken was to organize a kind of event by these scientists and a couple of other people interested in the environment at the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972. And we had the cooperation of the Swedish Prime Minister at that time, Olof Palme, but the US was successful in keeping war off the agenda of that conference. And so we were reduced to having a side event at which Palme participated, and so gave it a credibility and relevance. But what is important is that a powerful state was able to block any kind of effort at including within the agenda of environmental concerns what is done in the course of warfare. In other words, that war transcends accountability, at least for these geopolitical actors, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And there's a kind of Orwellian doublethink that is taking place at the present time. On the one hand, condemning Russia for committing aggression and violating the UN Charter, while at the same time understanding that the US particularly has used the right of veto in the Security Council to say that it's not accountable to international law unless it wants to be. See, that's an intolerable situation where the most dangerous states are given a right of veto and total impunity. If the framework of the legal framing is carried on through the UN. And so from the very beginning, I thought that the political traction and energy had to come from civil society. And therefore, I proposed at that time and drafted a tentative instrument calling for a convention on ecocide that was parallel to the Convention on Genocide and would give a much deeper direct roots in civil society activism, including the possibility of using people's tribunals as a way of assembling the evidence of both the crimes of state and the state collaboration with predatory capitalist actors. Another problem of going the ICC route is that it only pertains to persons, natural persons, not to corporations or the state. And it's almost impossible to satisfy the elements of crime with evidence that links the policies to the individuals that are involved. So my view is that it's important now to move toward pressure to create an international conference of states and with heavy NGO participation. Hopefully this center will be one of the participants in drafting a convention, an Ecocide convention, and doing so in a way that it recognizes that there are two forms of criminal activity that need our attention and focus. There is environmental crime committed daily and on an extensive basis through what I've been calling predatory capitalism, and is depicted very vividly and convincingly in David White's book, Ecocide. And his subtitle and the theme of the book is we need to kill the corporation before the corporation kills us. And that poses a controversial, provocative project, but the essence of the project is creating a state responsibility for regulating corporate activity under their control in a manner that is ecologically responsible. And it's, to me, that is a more direct and effective method of trying to address the challenge. And then aside from that challenge of predatory capitalism, there's the challenge of ecologically predatory political leadership of the sort that Bolsonaro has illustrated in Brazil, that puts at risk an ecosystem that is endangering the future of all humanity, is beyond Brazil's sole responsibility and competence. And the kind of use of pesticides or toxic materials in warfare. And the ecological crime that emanated from the Vietnam War is 50 years later causing genetic distortions in contemporary births. I was in Vietnam 3 or 4 years ago and visited a hospital with children and older people suffering from genetic deformities attributed to Agent Orange. And among other things, the US left huge stockpiles of Agent Orange in Vietnam, which have seeped into the water and the rivers and the soil, and is part of why the legacy, the temporal legacy, in a way, it has this kind of feature that's even worse than the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan, because there's no end to it. It has every prospect of continuing. And so this kind of state crime needs to be understood and acted in as effective a way as possible. But that won't happen without a civil society effort at public education and public mobilization. it is not enough to make a technical revision, an extension of the Rome Statute governing the International Criminal Court. So my hope is that this broader movement to address the role of the state in relation to ecological crime and ecocide is something that will unfold in the future and will enlist the energies of many segments of civil society. Let me stop there and hope I haven't exceeded the limit. So.
You haven't, Richard. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll get back to you on thinking about an international convention on ecocide. I will turn the floor now to Mònica, Mònica, you have a PowerPoint, yes?
Yes. Okay, can you see it? Yeah. Cool. Okay, so thank you, Angela, for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me here. As Angela said, I will talk about the state-corporate nexus in Spain and how it relates to ecocide. To do so, I will draw on different case studies of ecocide in Spain that hopefully it will illustrate how this nexus between both powers can cause environmental degradation. So first, I will talk about this state-corporate nexus and how it can impact policymaking using the case study of the Spanish government and its relationship with the fossil fuel industry. Then I will relate on the case study of the collapse of the Mar Menor to highlight how this interconnectedness between the public and the private sector causes environmental harm. And I will conclude with some thoughts around ecocide as a state crime using the case of the European eel. So what I found in my research exploring the revolving doors between the public office and the fossil fuel industry in Spain is the absolute interconnectedness of the state and the corporate sector within the neoliberal era. The revolving doors phenomenon is the movement of individuals from public office to private companies or the other way around, and it is believed to act against the public interest by impacting policymaking in favor of the corporate sector. I use the revolving doors phenomenon to explore this interconnectedness because it is a clear manifestation of the collaboration between both powers. Revolving doors appear across economic sectors and public positions, but these are more evident in essential services like fossil fuel industry or the food industry or the big pharma. And within these individuals that are involved in revolving doors, they occupy positions with the power to regulate, fund, or enforce the corporations. However, one of the main findings was that nowadays there is no need to actually move into one sector or the other to impact policymaking, because since the privatization process that started in the mid-80s, not only governments are actively legislating in favor of the private sector, but they are also increasingly outsourcing policymaking to lobby groups. For instance, the Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan in Spain, which comes from the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan after COVID, has been drafted with the collaboration of lobby groups. And in Spain, it included the Spanish Confederation of Business Organizations, which is a lobby group that encapsulates Enagas, Endesa, Iberdrola, Naturgy, and Repsol, which are the dominant electric and fossil fuel companies in Spain. So even though this plan promotes a transition towards a clean energy system away from fossil fuels, according to this plan, these companies will achieve this goal by receiving funds to develop hydrogen projects. To be precise, they were expected to receive the 70% of the funds available to Spain. The issue here is that 80% of the hydrogen is gray hydrogen, so reliant on natural gas. Therefore, it can lead to the capture of green hydrogen technologies to perpetuate the use and the profits attached to fossil fuels. As seen in the energy laws developed in Spain by politicians connected to the fossil fuel industry, these include the privatization of the public assets, the tax on the sun, which is a tax to install renewable energies on one's home, and the cuts on subsidies to renewable energies, and the recovery plan. It all led, this legislation that was developed by the politicians now working for the fossil fuel industry, increased energy poverty and climate policy inaction, which harm humans, non-humans, and environments. For this reason, there is a need to bring the state back into the center of the study of corporate crimes, because there is an active role of the state in constructing these regulatory environments that lead to social and environmental harm. Now, moving on to the case of the study of the collapse of the Mar Menor, it will illustrate how this close collaboration between the state and the corporate sector is not unique to revolving door movements. So, the Mar Menor is a coastal saltwater lagoon in Murcia, in Spain. It is considered a valuable ecosystem rich in biodiversity, with one area preserved as a natural park, another preserved as a protected landscape. It is part of the Convention on Wetlands, also considered a specially protected area of Mediterranean importance due to its biodiversity, and a special protected area for bird life. As reported, intensive farming and agriculture surrounding the areas lead to high levels of nitrates, ammonium, and phosphates from fertilizers and livestock waste being washed into the lagoon, causing an excessive growth of algae and bacteria that deprive the water of oxygen. In October 2019, the pollution killed 85% of the vegetation on its seabed and led to thousands of dead fish suffocating due to the lack of oxygen, an event that was repeated over again in August 2021. So here in this map, you can see the evolution of the seagrass loss from 2014 to 2017. And as reported, this case of Ecocide involves not only the pork and agricultural industries in the area, but also the former head of the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment of the government of Murcia, and the former water commissioner of the Segura Hydrographic Confederation, the management and regulatory body of the waters of the Segura Basin. As reported, both members of the government overlooked existing illegalities and the lack of compliance of controls of nitrates and agricultural companies and the existing pork industry. Accordingly, because it involves government and the private sector, this case of the Mar Menor can be framed as a state of corporate crime. So, the state corporate crime theory differentiates between state-initiated or facilitated corporate crimes and corporate-initiated and facilitated state crimes. But if analyzing this case within the state corporate crime theory, one could argue that it is a case of a state-facilitated corporate crime because it might seem that the government failed in regulating the business activities. But also it could be framed as a corporate-initiated state crime because the agriculture sector and the pork industry are vital economic sectors in the region, and they could employ their power to manipulate the states into taking criminal actions. But what if it's both? What if we cannot actually differentiate if this case was led by the state or the corporation because they are both bound together? So the state corporate synergies are structural to the system and product of the political economy instead of a moment of rupture. But how all of this relates to Ecocide? As mentioned by David White, almost every economic activity or sector devours nature, and we've seen this in both case studies. But if every activity harms the environment, then every activity should be criminalized. So where are the limits? Where will we draw the line to decide what is ecocide or what is not ecocide? And I believe that here is where ecocide turns into a state crime. First, because of the proposed legal definition of ecocide, because following the proposed legal definition, legally allowed environmental harm is an ecocide. But then again, if the state and the corporation are so heavily linked to the point that the states are giving powers to the corporations and lobby groups to regulate, ecocide caused by corporations may fall out of the criminal spectrum. And second, and building on this idea, because the states are and will be the ones in power to determine to which level it's okay to the power nature, to which level it is sustainable to exploit natural resources. Here, I think that the question, building on this huge state corporate crime, state corporate nexus, is who will inform this decision. If it will be economic criteria to ensure the continuity of business as usual and economic growth, or ecological criteria, or they will say both, and we will go into this green capitalism illusion that was discussed in the previous section with the book The Value of a Whale. I will wrap this with the example of the European eel, that is a species facing extinction with only 1% of the population left. So in Spain, fishing, trading, and consumption are allowed to protect economic interests, but are limited responding to ecological criteria. In accordance, eel fishing has fishing quotas in some countries, a fishing season restriction, and so on, supposedly responding to the sustainable exploitation of the species. However, as I found in my research, these limitations are also designed by states to not interfere with the economic sector and allow the eel business to continue with their business as usual. So these measures adopted are a form of greenwashing of the state responsibility because they, in fact, are allowing ecocide. The case of the European eel is actually a good example because following the indications of the ICES, which is the scientific community evaluating the recovery of the species, eel fishing, trading, and consumption should be banned. The European Union and the member states know this, but still they are ignoring the ecological criteria in defense of the lobby groups pressuring governments to avoid the total ban. Just to conclude all of this, I believe that this is how and why ecocide is a state crime. I believe that it's not only because the state gave powers or are giving powers to the corporations, but also because how the states are using their own power to protect the private instead of the public interest. Thank you so much. I will be happy to respond to any questions after that.
Thanks so much, Mònica. I think Stephen has just joined us right on time. So if you don't mind, Stephen, can I pass it to you?
Absolutely. I apologize for being late, and I'm got like a pretty hectic schedule, so I'm actually talking to you from a quiet corner of an isolated airport in the state of Maine in the United States. Hope that's okay. So first of all, thank you. I caught most of the last speaker's comments, and I just want to say, and I think the best thing that I can add to this discussion is tell a story, a little bit of the story of what the people of Ecuador's Amazon have experienced at the hands of the Chevron oil company as an illustration of what the crime of ecocide actually looks like on the ground. I am a lawyer from New York City, and I've been to this part of the world in Ecuador over 250 times. I first went down there in 1993, and as a lawyer to investigate, and this part of Ecuador has, is naturally beautiful. It's the Amazon rainforest. It's a pristine ecosystem. And when I got there in 1993, an American oil company, Texaco, it's now owned by Chevron. At the time, it was Texaco, had just left the country after operating in this area for 25 years. And they left literally 1,000 open air toxic waste pits that they gouged out of the jungle floor, into the sides of which they installed pipes that were used to drain the cancer-causing contents of these pits, commonly known as drilling muds, the oil waste that comes out of the ground when you perforate the earth for a well. And they would drain this stuff into rivers, streams that had been used for millennia by local indigenous groups, and more recently farmer communities, for their drinking water, for their bathing, and for their fishing. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate decision and engineering decision by Texaco to engage in operations that they knew would kill people. That's simple. That they knew would destroy the environment as it had been relied on in a very prosperous, healthy way by indigenous groups for hundreds of years. And they did it to save money on their production costs, to basically take what were already high profits to obscene levels. And when I got down there, I mean, I'm a trial lawyer, right? I'm not an academic authority on ecocide, although I study international law. I understand the law for the most part. I understand human rights law. On a human level, it was shocking to see what looked like an apocalyptic nightmare that had destroyed a good part of the Amazon rainforest. And the people with whom we spoke, the affected communities, were really hurting, and in a few short years had basically lost their wealth. I mean, wealth being their natural world, their ecosystems. You know, these are peoples who had lived without money, as we understand it, yet were extraordinarily prosperous just by living off the forest. So when the Texaco executives made the decision to deliberately pollute, I believe, if you look at the definition of ecocide, that they were engaging in the atrocity crime of ecocide, for which they could have been facing on a personal level criminal jeopardy, jail time, trials for engaging in acts that they knew would destroy the forest, that destroy the means through which the people there were able to survive and to live. And they knew also that, and it was clearly foreseeable given the literature at the time, this began in the 1960s and really took off in the 1970s and 1980s, but given the knowledge at the time, it was very clear that oil waste causes cancer and other types of serious health impacts, particularly on women, and also on children, you know, and that's been borne out by various independent peer-reviewed studies that have taken place in this part of the world that show incredibly high rates, for example, of childhood leukemia in oil-producing regions of Ecuador. So in any event, you know, I think the ecocide law is critically important. I think that it needs to move as fast as possible to be accepted by the international community. I think that along with, for example, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and various other things that are happening in the law, it's part of a suite of changes in the law that need to take place to save the planet. As for the people in the area of Ecuador where I work, Chevron lost our tort lawsuit and owes them $9.5 billion plus interest to clean up what they left behind. This is all about collective environmental cleanup. It's not about compensation for personal injuries. This case was affirmed by Ecuador Supreme Court in 2013. Chevron still has refused to pay. And they have spent probably $3 billion US on 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers to evade this judgment, which to me is just a continuation of the original crime of deciding to deliberately dump toxic waste onto the ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples, an act that is ongoing because the infrastructure they left is still out there, has not been cleaned up, and it's still polluting groundwater, it's still polluting streams and rivers, and those pipes are still running out of the pits into waterways that people rely on for their drinking water. Rather than pay, many people know that Chevron attacked me. They sued me in the United States for fraud. They paid a witness to lie. You know, I won't get into the details except to say that rather than pay the people to, you know, that they poisoned down in Ecuador and comply with the law in a case that they lost, they've been attacking the lawyers, primarily me. resulted in my 993-day detention on what I would argue is a completely bogus contempt of court charge lodged by a judge with investments in Chevron. This happened in New York. The judge took his contempt of court charge to the regular federal prosecutor in Manhattan, who refused to prosecute me. So the judge appointed a private Chevron law firm to prosecute me in the name of the US government. And that had never happened before in the United States. I believe I am the first target of a corporate prosecution ever in this country, or even in the world, because I've never seen this particular animal in our legal system before. I considered myself a corporate political prisoner. They still won't give me my passport back, so I can't leave the country and visit with my clients or help them organize their efforts to enforce their judgment. And, you know, to me, this is all a new chapter of the same story, which is, you know, it goes back to the origin story, which is a story of ecocide. So the previous speaker talked about complicity of the state. This is an example of that as well, where the government of Ecuador was in bed with Texaco and then Chevron and never stopped this, never even imposed a small fine on the company for clearly violating the environmental laws of the country. It took years and years and years of work to get Ecuador's government at the highest level to pay attention to the people, their own citizens who've been victimized by these awful practices. There is complicity. And I could go on with a lot more dimensions of this. This is, there's, for example, an international arbitration action that Chevron filed against Ecuador's government looking for a taxpayer-funded bailout from its victims of the cost of cleaning up the pollution they left. They're basically pulling out all the stops. I think they see this case and the larger campaign around it as a flashpoint that will determine whether or not they will face what's probably $1 trillion worth of environmental liability around the world, because if the people of Ecuador collect other communities around the world who've been victimized in similar ways by Chevron and other big oil companies, will be motivated to replicate the success of our campaign. So there's a lot at stake here. I want to just say the Ecocide law, again, is a vital piece of an overall strategy to get the law in alignment with reality and to save our planet. So I'll stop there and obviously entertain any questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my perspective.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I think we can now turn it over to the audience and have a question and answer discussion. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but if you have a question, please either just feel free to raise your hand or to pop a question into the chat. While we wait for some questions from the audience, oh, is there one question? Yes, Chriselle.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for those lectures. It's really my first time to really understand what ecocide is and the push to legalize it. So I guess just very basic questions. What are the biggest roadblocks for ecocide to be recognized as a crime, and what are the solutions to address this? And I know that right now there's a push for corporations to include climate and biodiversity disclosures, and if that could actually be of help in the bigger issue of ecocide. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chriselle. Does anyone else have a question? I think I'll put this question back to our panelists, but maybe I'll add to Chriselle's question, which is, given that there have been a lot of challenges with international law to secure environmental or climate justice in a lot of the different cases that were discussed today, should we be seeking other solutions in international law? Is international law something that we can look to for the types of responses that we're hoping for in terms of justice? So maybe if we could start with Richard. Oh, I think Richard, you're on mute.
Let me start by thanking Stephen for a fascinating depiction of this case, which is so deeply illuminating of the wider issues that we've been discussing, and has, as he suggested, incredible implications if it succeeds in creating a new insistence on minimal corporate responsibility and state accountability and responsibility for securing that kind of behavior and punitive responses in the event that atrocities of the sort that he described occur in the future. Let me just say a word about the roadblocks, and I think they're formidable. They're the very nexus of complicity between state and corporate capitalism, and that's the driving forces in what constitutes modernity. One is challenging the way in which modernity has evolved, and as I say, I'm not sure the place to begin is with lawyers pressing for legal modifications. I think you need a greater civil society mobilization that will induce governments and the international institutions that are relevant to move in a new progressive direction with respect to protecting people and the ecosystems that they're part of.
Thanks, Richard. Monica, did you want to come in on the question?
Yeah, well, I think quite in line with Richard. So what I see with the problem of international law is that at least the proposed definition, it's weak in relation of what is ecocide and what's not, and how to prove that that thing was reckless and wanton, and what is ecocide itself. So I don't think that to start with an international law would be enough. Like, for example, what we've seen now in Spain with the Mar Menor is that just a couple of days ago, it gained legal recognition as a person, so that it was protected. Now it's protected. So this was achieved because a huge amount of people in Spain was mobilized into asking this to their local government, and this is how they achieved the protection of the ecosystem. So this is why I'm more in line with Richard, that maybe we should first need an unprecedented mobilization of people, of the civil society, to push the governments into the right direction, because so far it seems that they are more in favor of the corporation than in favor of the public interest.
Thanks, Monica. Stephen, I don't know if you want to chime in on this in terms of, having this personal experience and looking at, some of the challenges in achieving, justice for communities. What kinds of things can we expect from international law, and should we, be looking for international law to provide solutions, or are there other solutions that we should also be looking at?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll give my perspective. First, Professor Falk, thank you. It's an honor to be on a panel with you. I admire you greatly, as well as Professor Pons. I'm really excited to be here. Let me just say this as a lawyer who's a practitioner, okay? I wholeheartedly agree that the law alone will never solve this problem, okay? However, I do believe a multiplicity of factors are needed that kind of work in synergy. And, you know, changes in the law are both produced by popular mobilization, but also feed into and, you know, strengthen popular mobilization. The process is very fluid and dynamic, and I think we need it all. For example, the whole ecocide, the concretization of the ecocide law through the Stop Ecocide movement, I think resulted to a great degree from mobilizations that were happening around the world on the climate issue. And then the creation of the law, I think, also provides a vehicle for further mobilization. So, you know, I think we need it all. I think part of the problem is a lot of lawyers, I would not include myself in this category, but a lot of lawyers are trained in law school to think that these problems can be solved through lawsuits. They can't. You know, lawsuits are components of broader strategies when they exist. And you don't necessarily need a lawsuit or a law to achieve the objectives that people are searching for, but at times they can be, you know, filing a lawsuit or using laws, changing laws can help change the culture that makes mobilization easier. You know, so I'd say it's all out there and we need to work on it all simultaneously and in synergy to the extent possible.
Could I make one first brief comment? I very much agree with what Stephen has just said about the importance of finding every response to this sort of ecological criminality that is destroying our planet. And I'd add one caveat that my experience among international law specialists is that Stephen is not typical. It's a very conservative professional orientation that I've encountered over my long career, and have really felt often marginalized in advancing these kinds of positions, either anti-war positions or pro-human rights or ecologically assertive positions. It is even among academic international lawyers, there's great reluctance to confront the established powers that be. And that's one of the big obstacles of relying too much on lawyers to rescue the planet from this kind of ecological harm and crime that it is experiencing. And the Chevron Texaco experience, I hope you write a book that really brings it to a wider public attention, because it is a metaphor for predatory capitalism. It's more than as huge as it is, $1 trillion. It's just a metaphor. I mean, it's not just, but it is a metaphor for how corporations are, in David White's terminology, killing us. We must fight back as people in danger.
Thanks for that, Richard. I think
Yeah.
go back
There's a
to
question. Look, I wasn't coming in because my name was mentioned. I was coming in because there's a question in the chat, just in case we've not seen it. But I do want to say, before we go to that question, very, very quickly, if I can, we had this debate in quite a lot of detail in the last couple of events that where we discussed Ecocide, and there were two major kind of issues that we got to in terms of that challenge and that kind of thinking about how social power from below can be important here. And you know, there's no right or wrong in every single case, but we do know that in a lot of struggles, legal struggles, if they're just focused on the law, take energy, sap energy, and take it in a particular direction. And so I think it's very difficult to get into this discussion about whether, you know, legal solutions are the right thing or the wrong thing, but very often they do depoliticize, and I hope we get onto that discussion later. But sorry, Siddharth has a question there, Angela, which I think is about a bit. Is this the UK bits we're talking about, business impact targets? Maybe Siddharth could clarify that. Bilateral investment treaties, sorry, of course, which is of course crucial in the Chevron case. Sorry, back to you, Angela.
No.
I knew I was wrong.
Thanks, Dave. So we actually have two questions. We have one question that is in the chat from Siddharth saying, could we see the principles of Ecocide being incorporated within bilateral investment treaties, and how can they be incorporated? And then if I could just pass it over to John, who has a question.
Hi. Yeah, there was kind of two things. One, I wanted to kind of go after Dr. Pons-Hernández's theory of the revolving door, which is there's been this increasing phenomenon of, you know, people who were involved in labor suppression in South America or human rights crimes in South America, particularly state corporate crimes. You know, there are individuals who, you know, helped Coca-Cola and Chiquita Banana, you know, torture and execute labor organizers and indigenous rights activists who are now consultants to the U.S. government and who continue to help those corporations. And how does something like that work, where it's not just someone going and sitting on the board of a company after they've served in the Senate or something like that and getting a favorable deal? They've actually kind of been involved on the front lines, so to speak, with you know, firsthand acts of torture and execution of the individuals who are trying to help those communities. And then the second thing I wanted to kind of get into is this whole issue of the power of the corporation that Stephen has talked about. And I want to kind of use Nestle as an example. I mean, the Nestle CEO has talked about how he doesn't believe water is a human right. There's been a recent decision from the US Supreme Court that says Nestle can face no liability for the use of child slavery. You know, this whole idea of the limits of the law, where if you have a corporation that is quite literally using child slaves, is, you know, using slave labor in Africa, is executing union leaders, torturing labor activists, and there's just nothing you can do, and yet they have unlimited capital where they can, you know, ruin the lives of human rights organizers and lawyers. They can buy off members of, you know, human rights tribunals and that sort of thing. I mean, it just kind of boggles the mind as to what can actually be done. Sorry, I know I'm rambling a bit, but it just kind of makes me like question like the extent to which any of these things can be dealt with, not just in the legal system, but just through the issue of law itself, as constrained by capital and politics.
Yeah, I think those are both really good questions. And maybe if, as the chair, I just add one to that. I mean, I think what John is sort of asking here is, you know, given the structural relation between organized capital and state institutions, and the way that sort of these interactions produce enormous harm, what's the best way to sort of break open this type of power structure? So maybe if we turn it over to maybe Mònica first. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. And please feel free to answer, the questions that you feel have sort of interacted with your area of research.
Sorry, I didn't get the question very well, I think. I guess that I think it's quite difficult to break the relationship at the end, because the politicians usually, at least in Spain, most of them don't have a background. They just start working as politicians when they are young, and they just keep evolving inside the political party. So when they arrive to a point of retirement because they finish their legislation, they don't have a salary after that. And of course, they are used to a level of life that they want to keep having this amount of capital at the end of the month. So they rely on the corporation because they know that the corporation can provide this economic stability. But then I think that maybe the way of breaking down this power would be resocializing back the state. Like what we've seen in the 80s in Spain with the privatization of the electric companies, they were a public asset at the beginning, same with the transport and everything. So if the essential services went back to the ownership of the state, I don't think that private companies should have ownership of basic things for the society. So maybe the way of breaking this would be giving back the power to the state on these basic things, like food and land and water and transport and so on.
Thanks, Monica. Maybe we can go to Richard. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on what Monica has just said, and also on the questions that were asked.
Well, these are very fundamental challenges that it's difficult to envision at this point how one builds the political traction to really challenge these illicit connections that the state has made with the most evil doing forces in the world. I think the examples that John gave us are very telling, and one is also reminded of, in especially the American context, of the military-industrial complex, in which the phenomenon, I think, of revolving doors got its start, and blessing from the highest levels of the political culture. And so my sense is that it really does depend on a transformative politics to challenge these basic structures of power and authority. And it will be one sort of back at the point where of that startling question that Margaret Thatcher put in her phrase, "Tina, there is no alternative." See, what we're really talking about is that there must be an alternative, and that we have to create an alternative, or else the panel and or else the planet and the species are doomed. See, it's as serious as that. It raises the question: does the human species have a collective will to survive, and can it bring that will to bear on these kinds of issues? It certainly, individuals have a will to survive, and states have a will to survive, but as a species, it's never been challenged in this holistic way before. And I don't know if there is the political foundations for a transformative politics that goes to these toxic roots of power and wealth that now afflict social, economic policies and are responsible for the crisis of ecocide.
Thanks, Richard. Maybe before I move on to Stephen, I mean, there's a question that sort of builds on that, which is in the chat, in terms of you talking about, what types of political foundations are there. What Chriselle asks, what could financial institutions' role be to address ecocide in terms of thinking of the different institutional components that there are and how different institutions might be, have different roles in terms of their relationships to states and corporations.
Were you asking me, Angela?
Yeah,
or-
sorry. I just thought because you were just going on there about, kind of the international architecture, there's a question there about financial institutions. And do you think financial institutions have a role to play in addressing ecocide?
Well, they have a potential role to play, but at the moment, they are part of the problem, not the solution. They're essentially extensions of corporate and state power and instrumentalities for special interests in making specific activities more profitable and suppressing the externalities or the adverse human consequences. So again, it's a problem of how do you build the political foundation for transformative political economy. I mean, that's what, we know what's wrong and we know what needs to be done, but we don't know how to get it done. That's, to me, the central issue.
Thanks, Richard. I don't know if Stephen is still with us.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Stephen, I don't know if you want to come in, on a series of questions about, what's the best way to sort of break open the, power structure between states and corporations, given, especially that you've been a target personally of, corporate capture of the judiciary. I don't know if you have some thoughts that you might want to weigh in on that question.
Happy to. Can you see me? I don't know if my video is on.
We can't see you. We can hear you though.
I don't know if I turned it off inadvertently or not. Can you get me back on from your end?
I don't.
Okay, hold on. Here we go.
There you are.
Let's see. Okay. Can you see me? Okay, I can't.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, here goes. So, just listening to this discussion, which I find fascinating, I really want to just say the following. I think it's really, really important that we, as as academics, as lawyers, as professionals, we're also part of the citizens movement. And I think it's really, we don't exist apart from that. I think it's really important that everyone, including ourselves, not succumb to the idea that the power structure is so overwhelming, there's nothing we can do about it. First of all, I acknowledge can be overwhelming. It is enormously powerful. Complicity between governments and corporations is really frightening, but it's also strong as it's ever been. I mean, I've been watching this stuff for decades as a lawyer, and you could take the whole arc of my professional career over 3 decades, and it's just gotten worse and worse. And it's terrible now, especially in the United States, given our, the control of our judiciary, by very corporatist right-wing elements who have become judges, including those who had me prosecuted directly by Chevron. Like, I think what happened to me might not have happened had this evolution in corporate control of government in the United States not taken place to the degree that it has. So the question then becomes like, what to do about it? And, you know, in my little corner of the universe, I work with people in Ecuador, obviously, to do a legal case that has caused great discomfort to the fossil fuel industry, and in some ways is a sort of model of how, you know, financial risk and accountability can be imposed on this industry to a greater degree than ever before by people with no money. I mean, the people who did this, it's not me who did this. I'm just the lawyer. Like, the people who did this really are the community leaders, you know, in an alliance with supporters around the world, including professionals like myself. And I really believe the model that we used is terrifying to the industry. And it explains why they, in my view, engage in nakedly corrupt acts to try to disable my work. But there is much that can be accomplished, even if what we might want to call a clean victory always seems to be out of reach. You know, it's all a dynamic process. And I just think that the power structures that corporations and their government allies create to protect their profits and their capital and to keep working people down are extensive. I mean, the bilateral investment treaty process, I think someone mentioned, is a perfect example of that. You know, there's all these legal mechanisms that have been created to protect corporate power. So yeah, it is a little weird using those same laws that are designed to protect their profits against them, but there are spaces out there in the structure to do some significant work. And I just think we need to find those spaces, you know, be smart about it, organize, try to get resources that are needed to do this work, and to just go for it. Because the alternative is a mass collective death, because that's really what's happening right now. I mean, we are all going to suffer, our kids, our grandkids, because of the destruction of the planet, because of the rapaciousness of the corporate structure supported by state. So we just have to keep fighting and trying. I hope that doesn't sound naive, because I recognize the enormity of what we're up against. I really do. I'm not saying that doing this will guarantee victory. It won't, not in the near term, but it could produce progress that can lead to some real significant changes that can help all of us.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. And I think we will post in the chat the link to your defense fund if anyone is interested in learning more about Stephen's case and the case and the role of Chevron to use US judges to go after Stephen. There is an ongoing case and there's a defense fund, and a lot of civil society activists have been working with Stephen on the case. I think this is probably a good point to wrap up and say thank you to our three speakers. It's been a pleasure having you here tonight to talk about the role of the state, to talk about the state corporate capture and the state corporate crimes. I'm going to turn it over to Dave now, just to give a bit of a brief overview of our upcoming seminars.
Yeah, thanks so much to all of our speakers for really, in very different contexts, for really nailing down some of the issues that we are going to continue to deal with. No easy answers to any of those questions, but questions that we have to keep asking, and we have to keep finding ways of challenging power through asking those questions. And the next point at which we're going to do that is on October the 21st, and we're going to have a meeting, again, an online discussion about COP27, which is coming up. And really, largely, that's because of an increasing awareness that those COP conferences of the parties meetings that deal with the implement international treaties on climate change are failing us, and failing us badly, particularly after the collapse of some of the things that came out of Glasgow. So we've got a range of speakers, very well-known speakers, with a very deliberate flavour from the global south to get perspectives on what the point of those COP meetings are. It's provocatively called "What is the point of COP27?" and features Vandana Shiva, Walden Bello, Hilal Elva, and Assad Raymond, all people who've been involved directly in those COP meetings, trying to shape things from below, and have all of whom have been frustrated. So I think that'll be an important event. I'm trying desperately to post in the chat. I think I've managed to do it now. Yeah, I was frozen for a minute there. Hold on, I'm just going to post the link where you can details, and the link to that event is there. Also, please just bear in mind, on the 9th of December, it's a long way off and we don't have registration for it, but we're going to have a one-day conference on West Papua, one of the most ignored but most environmentally sensitive areas of rainforest, third largest rainforest area in the world. And there are struggles right now to keep corporate interests out of those areas. And we're going to have a discussion on December the 9th, a one-day conference. So keep your eyes peeled for any details about that. We don't have a link, but I'll post what we have in the chat. Thanks everyone for coming. Back to Angela to say goodbye, because you've done very well to chair this. I think you have to have the last word, Angela.
Okay, bye everyone.